Red dust swirled across the observation deck as David Reed pressed his face against the reinforced glass. 3 massive shapes moved through the volcanic plains below, their scales catching the double sunset in ways that made his breath catch. They were beautiful and terrible at the same time. Each creature stood nearly 4 meters tall at the shoulder, with wings folded against bodies that gleamed like polished obsidian. Veins of orange and gold pulsed beneath their dark scales, making them look like living lava flows. David had been on Dravis 7 for 8 months now, studying the native wildlife for the Colonial Xenobiology Department. Most days were boring. He cataloged rock beetles and measured the temperature tolerance of crystalline moss. Nothing had prepared him for this. The 3 dragons circled something in the valley below. Even from this distance, David could see the fresh kill between them. It looked like a slag beast, one of the large herbivores that grazed on mineral deposits. The body was still steaming in the cool evening air. The smallest dragon darted forward, trying to grab a piece of meat. The largest one roared and lunged, snapping jaws that could easily crush steel. The smaller one jumped back just in time. Black smoke billowed from its nostrils as it hissed in frustration. "They're going to tear each other apart," someone said behind David. He turned to see Patricia Wong, the colony's chief engineer. Her face was pale as she watched the scene below. "They're siblings," David said quietly. "Look at the scale patterns. They came from the same clutch." "I don't care if they're twins," Patricia replied. "They're too close to the eastern mining platform. If they start breathing fire, we'll lose half our equipment." The middle-sized dragon made its move while the other 2 were distracted. It grabbed a large chunk of meat and tried to fly away with it. The biggest dragon roared and launched itself into the air. The collision was brutal. Both creatures slammed into the ground hard enough to send tremors through the observation deck. David grabbed his tablet and started recording. This was unprecedented. The Dravidian flameworms were supposed to be solitary hunters. Adults were rarely seen, and juveniles like these were thought to scatter immediately after hatching. No one had ever documented siblings staying together this long. "What are you doing?" Patricia demanded. "My job," David said, not looking away from his screen. "Recording behavior patterns. Your job is about to get us all killed. I'm calling security." She stormed off before David could respond. He knew what that meant. The colony kept weapons for dealing with dangerous wildlife. High-powered sonic cannons that could rupture organs from 100 meters away. Explosive charges that could bring down creatures twice the size of these dragons. Down below, all 3 hatchlings were fighting now. They bit and clawed at each other with shocking violence. The largest one, which David mentally named Ash for its darker coloring, seemed determined to drive the others away completely. It kept lunging at the smallest dragon, a creature with slightly paler scales that David decided to call Cinder. The middle dragon, Ember, was different. It didn't engage directly. Instead, it kept circling, waiting for opportunities. When Ash focused on Cinder, Ember would dart in and steal another piece of meat. It was smart, calculating, but Cinder wasn't backing down despite being clearly outmatched. Every time Ash drove it back, it would circle around and try a different approach. The little dragon had determination that David found himself admiring. A klaxon blared through the observation deck. David's stomach sank. That was the alert for the security team mobilizing. He had maybe 10 minutes before they arrived with weapons. He looked back at the dragons. They were exhausted now, sides heaving as they glared at each other across the ruined carcass. None of them had eaten much. Most of the meat lay trampled and torn in the dust between them. All that fighting, and they'd accomplished nothing except hurting each other. David made a decision that would probably get him fired or killed. Possibly both. He grabbed his field pack and headed for the airlock. Behind him, he could hear Patricia's voice over the intercom, demanding that all non-essential personnel evacuate the eastern sector. He ignored it. The outer door hissed open, and the heat of Dravis 7 hit him like a physical force. Even with the double sun setting, the temperature was over 40 degrees Celsius. The air smelled like sulfur and hot metal. David started down the path toward the valley. His legs felt shaky, but he forced himself to keep moving. This was insane. He knew it was insane. But he also knew that if the security team killed these dragons, humanity would lose something important. A chance to understand. A chance to bridge the gap between species. The dragons noticed him when he was about 50 meters away. All three heads swiveled in his direction. 6 eyes glowing like molten gold fixed on him with predatory intensity. David stopped walking. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs. Slowly, very slowly, he raised his hands to show he was unarmed. The dragons didn't move. They just watched him with that terrible, beautiful focus. Behind him, he heard shouts. The security team had arrived at the observation deck. They would be coming down soon. David took another step forward. Then another. The smallest dragon, Cinder, growled low in its throat. Smoke curled from its nostrils. "Easy," David whispered, knowing they couldn't understand but hoping his tone might convey something. "I'm not here to hurt you." He took one more step, and that's when everything changed. David spent the next 3 days living in a prefab shelter at the edge of the valley. The colony administrator had been furious, but David's supervisor at the xenobiology department backed his decision. They gave him 1 week to prove his theory was worth the risk. After that, the dragons would be relocated by force or eliminated if relocation proved impossible. Through his observation scope, David watched everything. The 3 dragons had claimed different sections of the valley as temporary territories. Ash took the highest ground, a rocky outcrop that gave a clear view of the entire area. Ember chose a cluster of crystalline formations near a thermal vent. Cinder, the smallest, settled for a low depression that offered protection but poor visibility. None of them were eating well. David documented their hunting attempts. They were terrible at it. Ash would charge at prey animals with all the subtlety of an avalanche, scaring everything away before getting close. Ember tried ambush tactics but lacked the patience to wait long enough. Cinder was simply too small to bring down anything substantial alone. On the second day, David witnessed something that confirmed his theory. A slag beast wandered into the valley at dawn. All 3 dragons spotted it simultaneously. Instead of working together to bring it down, they fought each other for the right to hunt it. By the time they'd finished arguing, the slag beast had wandered away unharmed. These weren't monsters. They were orphans who didn't know how to survive. David pulled up everything the xenobiology database had on Dravidian flame worms. The information was sparse. Adult dragons were rarely seen and never studied up close. They were massive, territorial, and extremely dangerous. Hatchlings were thought to be independent from birth, scattering across the volcanic plains to establish their own territories. But that didn't match what David was seeing. These 3 stayed within a kilometer of each other. Despite their fights, none of them ever left the valley completely. They kept coming back to this place, to each other. David started making notes about their individual personalities. Ash was the most aggressive, constantly trying to assert dominance. The dragon's behavior reminded David of an insecure teenager, all bluster and threat displays but lacking any real strategy. Whenever another dragon got food, Ash would try to steal it rather than hunting independently. Ember was smarter. The middle dragon watched everything with calculating eyes. It learned from mistakes quickly. David noticed that Ember had stopped making direct charges at prey. Instead, it started using the terrain, trying to drive animals toward obstacles. The problem was that Ember tried to do everything alone. It never occurred to the dragon that help might be available. Cinder broke David's heart a little. The smallest dragon was persistent to the point of self-destruction. It would challenge Ash even when clearly outmatched. David watched Cinder try to hunt a creature twice its size, getting knocked around but refusing to give up. The little dragon had courage but no sense of its own limitations. On the 3rd evening, David saw what he'd been waiting for. A pack of thermal wolves entered the valley, hunting the same prey the dragons needed. There were 6 wolves, each one the size of an adult human. They moved with coordinated precision, cutting off escape routes and driving a young slag beast toward the pack leaders. The dragons watched from their separate positions. David held his breath, hoping they might recognize the common threat and work together. Ash roared and charged the wolves alone. It was a disaster. The wolves scattered, then regrouped and counterattacked from multiple angles. Ash took several nasty bites before retreating, bleeding from wounds along its flanks. The wolves claimed the slag beast and settled in to feed. All 3 dragons could only watch from a distance, hungry and defeated. That night, David made his decision. These dragons had intelligence. They could learn. But their instincts were pushing them toward competition when cooperation was what they needed to survive. In nature, their mother would have taught them these skills. Without her, they were just 3 scared juveniles who only knew how to fight each other. David could change that. Humans had thousands of years of experience teaching cooperation. His own species had gone from tribal warfare to building interstellar colonies by learning to work together. If humans could overcome their competitive instincts, maybe he could teach these dragons to do the same. The question was how. He couldn't just walk up and start giving lessons. They were still wild animals, capable of killing him with a casual swipe of their claws. He needed to establish trust first, and he needed to show them that cooperation wasn't weakness but strength. David spent the rest of the night planning. He had access to the colony's protein synthesizers. He could create food sources. The colony also had equipment he could borrow, tools that might help demonstrate concepts these dragons could understand. When dawn broke over Dravis 7, painting the volcanic plains in shades of orange and purple, David packed his gear. He loaded a portable synthesizer onto a small utility vehicle, along with several crates of equipment. Then he drove down into the valley directly between the three dragons' territories. All three of them noticed immediately. They emerged from their resting spots, watching him with suspicious curiosity. David climbed out of the vehicle and started unpacking. His hands shook slightly, but he kept his movements calm and deliberate. He set up the synthesizer and activated it. The machine hummed as it began producing fresh protein blocks, each one about the size of his torso. The smell of synthetic meat filled the air. All three dragons' heads lifted, nostrils flaring. David placed one block on the ground in front of Ash's territory. Then he drove to Ember's area and placed another. Finally, he left one near Cinder's depression. 3 separate food sources. No competition necessary. This was step 1. The 5th day marked the real beginning. David had established a pattern. Every morning and evening, he delivered food to 3 separate locations. The dragons learned to expect him. They stopped seeing him as a threat and started viewing him as something else. Not quite a friend, but not prey either. Something in between. Ash was the first to eat from the protein blocks while David was still nearby. The large dragon approached cautiously, eyes never leaving the human, and grabbed the food before retreating to a safe distance. Ember and Cinder followed this example by the 2nd day. But David hadn't come to Dravis 7 to run a feeding program. He came to teach cooperation. On the 5th morning, he changed the rules. Instead of 3 separate portions, David placed one large synthesized carcass in the center of the valley. It was huge, easily enough for all 3 dragons to share. Then he sat down on a rock about 20 meters away and waited. Ash arrived first, drawn by the smell. The dragon circled the food suspiciously, looking for the trap. When nothing happened, Ash moved in and started eating. That's when Ember appeared. The middle dragon approached carefully, but Ash immediately lunged forward, roaring a challenge. Ember backed off, settling down to wait at a distance. Cinder arrived moments later and tried to dart in from the side. Ash charged, snapping its jaws. Cinder retreated, hissing in frustration. This was exactly what David had expected. Ash believed that size meant sole ownership. The largest dragon would monopolize the food while the others went hungry, even though there was plenty for everyone. David stood up. All 3 dragons noticed immediately, their attention shifting to him. He walked slowly toward the carcass, putting himself between Ash and the food. This was the most dangerous thing he'd done yet. Ash could easily kill him. The dragon was already agitated, possessive of the meal. But David had studied enough animal behavior to know that confidence often mattered more than size. He didn't make eye contact directly. That would be a challenge. Instead, he moved with calm certainty, his body language radiating authority without aggression. Ash growled, smoke curling from its nostrils. David stopped walking but didn't back up. He held his ground, one hand raised in a stopping gesture. The moment stretched. David could feel his pulse in his throat. One wrong move and this experiment would end with him in a medical pod or worse. Ash took a step back. Just one step, but it was enough. The dragon had acknowledged David's presence as meaningful. David pulled out a small device from his belt. It was a sonic emitter, calibrated to a frequency that the dragons found uncomfortable but not painful. He'd been testing it at a distance for days. Now he activated it for just 1 second, a brief pulse. All 3 dragons flinched. The sound was wrong to their senses, irritating. David pointed at Ember, then pointed at the far side of the carcass. The dragon didn't understand the gesture, but it understood something had changed. Slowly, Ember approached. When Ash moved to challenge, David activated the sonic emitter again. Just a brief pulse aimed at Ash. The large dragon stopped, confused. Food had never been controlled by anything other than size and strength before. This small creature was introducing new rules, and Ash didn't know how to respond. David pointed at Cinder next, indicating the opposite side of the carcass from Ember. The small dragon crept forward, watching both Ash and the human carefully. For one perfect moment, all three dragons stood around the food. Then Ash lunged at Cinder again. David hit the sonic emitter, this time holding it for 2 seconds. Ash roared in frustration and backed away from the food entirely. David walked to the carcass, physically placed himself between Ash and the others, and waited. The message was clear. If you fight, no one eats. They stayed like that for almost an hour. Ash circled and growled but didn't charge. Ember and Cinder watched nervously, too scared to eat with Ash so agitated. David stood his ground, occasionally using the sonic emitter when Ash got too close. Finally, exhaustion won. Ash settled down at a distance, watching with frustrated golden eyes. David pointed at the carcass and stepped back. He gestured to all three dragons in turn. The invitation was obvious even if they didn't understand human body language fully. Ember moved first, always the quickest to adapt. The middle dragon approached the food and started eating, but kept watching Ash and the human. When nothing happened, Cinder joined in, taking the opposite side. Ash waited another 10 minutes, pride warring with hunger. Eventually, hunger won. The large dragon approached slowly and took a position at the carcass. For the first time, all three siblings ate together without fighting. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't much. They were still tense, still watching each other with suspicion. But it was a start. Over the next few days, David repeated this pattern. One large food source. The sonic emitter when fights broke out. His presence as a neutral enforcer of fairness. The dragons learned slowly, but they learned. Ash discovered that cooperation meant eating without injuries. Ember learned that it didn't need to scheme for every meal. Cinder realized that being smallest didn't mean going hungry. By the end of the first week, David could place the food and walk away. The three dragons would approach together, still careful, still maintaining distance, but no longer fighting. They'd established an unspoken agreement. Approach from different angles. Take portions without crowding. Eat quickly but without panic. It wasn't friendship. Not yet, but it was progress. David sent his first report to the xenobiology department. The footage showed 3 juvenile Dravidian flame worms feeding peacefully together, mediated by human intervention. The response came back within hours. His supervisor was impressed but cautious. David's time was extended to 3 weeks. That night, David sat outside his shelter, watching the 3 dragons rest in different parts of the valley. They were closer together than before, he noticed. Not quite sleeping near each other, but not maintaining the maximum distance either. He pulled out his tablet and started planning the next phase. Peaceful eating was one thing. True cooperation was another. For that, he needed to create situations where working together provided better rewards than working alone. Tomorrow he would introduce the first puzzle. A feeding mechanism that required 2 dragons to operate simultaneously. He wasn't sure it would work. But teaching cooperation had to start somewhere, and humans had always been good at solving problems together. Maybe these dragons could learn the same lesson. David built the mechanism in the colony workshop, working through most of the night. It was simple in concept, but required precise coordination to operate. 2 pressure plates positioned 3 meters apart. Both needed to be activated simultaneously to release a large food container suspended between them. 1 dragon alone couldn't reach both plates. 2 working together could. He installed it at dawn, using the utility vehicle to position the heavy frame in the center of the valley. The food container at the top was sealed, but the smell of fresh protein wafted through ventilation holes. All 3 dragons would know it was there. By the time David finished setup, the 3 siblings had emerged from their resting spots. They watched his work with curious attention, having learned that his activities usually meant food. David stepped back from the mechanism and gestured toward it, inviting them to investigate. Then he retreated to his usual observation spot and waited. Ash approached first, moving with characteristic boldness. The dragon circled the frame, sniffing at the food container overhead. Ash reared up on hind legs, trying to reach it with a foreclaw. Too high. The dragon roared in frustration and slammed against one of the pressure plates. The container trembled but didn't open. It needed both plates activated at the same time. Ash tried again, this time attempting to stand on one plate while stretching toward the other. The dragon was large, but not large enough. The plates remained just beyond reach. Ember arrived next, studying the mechanism with calculating eyes. The middle dragon watched Ash's attempts, then moved to investigate the second pressure plate. Ember stepped on it experimentally. Nothing happened. The dragon looked up at the food, then at the other plate where Ash stood. For a moment, David thought they might figure it out. Both dragons were positioned correctly. All they needed to do was press down simultaneously. But Ash spotted Ember on the other plate and immediately interpreted it as competition. The large dragon abandoned its position and charged, driving Ember away from the mechanism entirely. Ash returned to trying to solve the puzzle alone, smashing against the frame with increasing frustration. This continued for over an hour. Each dragon took turns investigating the mechanism. Each one tried to solve it individually. Whenever two dragons were positioned correctly by accident, one would spot the other and attack rather than cooperate. Cinder was the most persistent. The small dragon kept returning after being driven off, approaching from different angles trying to find a solution. But Cinder was also the weakest. Whenever the little dragon got close, Ash would chase it away with barely any effort. David watched all of this with careful attention. This was the critical moment. They were so close to understanding, but their instincts kept sabotaging them. He needed to show them what cooperation looked like. He stood up and walked toward the mechanism. All three dragons backed away, giving him space. They'd learned that his presence meant the rules changed. David pulled a remote control from his pocket and activated a secondary feature he'd built into the mechanism. Two small platforms extended from the base, positioned directly under each pressure plate. Then he called over his radio. "Patricia, you there?" "What do you need, David?" The engineer's voice crackled back. "I need you to come down to the valley. Bring a protein bar." There was a long pause. "You want me to walk into a valley with 3 dragons because you need a protein bar?" "I need help demonstrating something." "It's important." Another pause. "You're insane. I'll be there in 10 minutes. When Patricia arrived, she looked terrified but determined. David appreciated that she trusted him enough to come despite her fear. "See those 2 platforms?" David pointed. "I need you to stand on one. I'll stand on the other. We press down together and the food releases. That's your big plan? Show them teamwork. Sometimes the best teaching method is demonstration." They positioned themselves on the platforms. David counted down. 3, 2, 1, press. They both stepped firmly on the pressure plates. The mechanism clicked, and the food container opened, dropping its contents between them. The smell of fresh meat filled the air. All 3 dragons' attention locked onto the scene. They watched as David and Patricia shared the food, each taking a portion. The message was clear. 2 individuals working together both benefited. Patricia left quickly after, still nervous around the dragons. David reset the mechanism with a new food container and backed away. Now the dragons knew what needed to happen. The question was whether they could overcome their competitive instincts long enough to do it. Ember figured it out first. The smart dragon positioned itself on one pressure plate and stayed there, looking expectantly at the other plate. This was new behavior. Ember was waiting, inviting cooperation. Cinder approached cautiously. The small dragon had watched David's demonstration carefully. Cinder moved to the second platform and both dragons looked at each other across the 3-meter gap. Then Ash charged in, roaring. The large dragon pushed Cinder off the platform and tried to claim both positions again. Back to square one. David activated his sonic emitter. The pulse made all 3 dragons flinch. He walked to Ash and pointed away from the mechanism. The message was clear. Disrupt cooperation and you get nothing. Ash retreated, growling but unwilling to challenge the human's authority directly. David gestured to Ember and Cinder, inviting them to try again. Both dragons returned to their positions, moving carefully. They stood on their respective plates, but the timing was off. Ember pressed down a second before Cinder. Nothing happened. They tried again. This time Cinder pressed first. Still nothing. On the 3rd attempt, something miraculous happened. Both dragons pressed down simultaneously. The container opened and food dropped between them. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Ember and Cinder approached the food together, each taking portions without fighting. They'd done it. 2 dragons who'd been trying to kill each other just days ago had worked together and both benefited. Ash watched from a distance, conflicted. The large dragon wanted that food, but had been excluded from obtaining it. David reset the mechanism again. This time he pointed at Ash and then at Ember, indicating they should try together. Ash hesitated, pride wounded by being directed by a creature so much smaller. But hunger and curiosity won. Ash approached one platform while Ember took the other. They were terrible at it initially. Ash would press too early or too late. Ember kept flinching, expecting an attack. It took 6 attempts. 6 failures, but on the 7th try they synchronized. The food dropped and both dragons fed. David reset it one final time. Now he gestured to Ash and Cinder. This pairing was the most difficult. Ash had been bullying Cinder since the beginning. The small dragon was terrified of its largest sibling. Cinder approached the platform so hesitantly that David thought the little dragon might abandon the attempt. But hunger pushed Cinder forward. Ash took the other position, and for the first time the large dragon waited patiently instead of attacking. They pressed down together on the 2nd attempt. When the food dropped, Ash didn't try to claim it all. The large dragon took a portion and let Cinder eat the rest without interference. David sat down on his rock, exhausted but elated. It had taken all day, but they'd learned something fundamental. Working together produced better results than fighting alone. As the twin suns set that evening, all 3 dragons rested closer together than ever before. 3 weeks had passed since David first walked into the valley. The transformation was remarkable. The 3 dragons who'd once fought over every scrap now moved through their territory with coordinated efficiency. They still had individual personalities, but those differences had become complementary rather than competitive. David documented everything. Ember had become the planner, always surveying situations before acting. Ash provided the strength and intimidation factor when needed. Cinder brought agility and persistence that neither of the larger siblings possessed. Together they covered each other's weaknesses. He watched them hunt one morning, and it was like seeing a completely different species. A herd of slag beasts grazed near the eastern edge of the valley. The 3 dragons didn't charge in mindlessly. Instead, they spread out, using the terrain to their advantage. Ember moved wide to the left, positioning behind a cluster of rocks. Ash took the high ground, becoming visible to the herd. Cinder circled right, staying low and quiet. When Ash roared and charged, the slag beasts panicked and ran directly into the ambush Ember and Cinder had prepared. They brought down 2 large adults, more food than they'd successfully hunted in all the previous weeks combined, and they shared the kill without any intervention from David. No fighting. No stealing. They simply ate together, like they'd been doing it their whole lives. The colony administrator visited on the 21st day. Governor Harris was a stern woman, who'd been skeptical of David's project from the beginning. She stood in the observation shelter, watching through David's high-powered scope as the 3 dragons worked together to excavate a thermal vent, their fire breath melting through rock to reach the heat source beneath. "You've trained them," Harris said. It wasn't a question. "I've taught them to cooperate," David corrected. "There's a difference. Training implies commands and obedience. What they're doing is choosing to work together because they've learned it's beneficial. Can they be trusted around colonists?" David considered the question carefully. They're not pets. They're intelligent beings with their own agency, but they associate human presence with positive outcomes now. As long as we don't threaten them or their territory, I believe they'll be peaceful neighbors. That's not very reassuring. It's realistic. We're sharing this planet with them, Governor. The question isn't whether we can control them completely. It's whether we can coexist respectfully. Harris was quiet for a long moment. The mining division wants to expand eastward. That means moving closer to this valley. Then we need to establish clear boundaries. The dragons respect territory. If we mark our zones clearly and don't encroach on theirs, there shouldn't be conflict. And if there is, David didn't have a perfect answer for that. Then we address it the same way I've been addressing everything else. Communication, boundaries, and mutual benefit. That afternoon brought an unexpected test. David was conducting his routine check when his radio crackled with an urgent message from Patricia. "David, we've got a problem. There's an adult dragon approaching from the western ridge. Big one, really big." David's blood went cold. Adult Dravidian flame worms were apex predators, territorial and aggressive. If one was approaching the valley, it probably saw the 3 juveniles as competition or invaders. He grabbed his emergency beacon and activated it, then rushed to get a visual. The adult was massive, easily 3 times the size of Ash. Its scales were deep crimson, and when it roared, the sound echoed across the entire valley. The three siblings heard it too. They emerged from different locations, drawn by the challenge. For a moment, David feared they might revert to their old behavior, each trying to face the threat alone. Instead, something beautiful happened. The three dragons moved together, positioning themselves in a defensive formation. Ash took the center, the largest target. Ember and Cinder flanked on either side, creating a united front. The adult dragon descended from the ridge, moving with predatory confidence. It roared again, a clear territorial challenge. In the wild, juvenile dragons would scatter when confronted by an adult. Running was the survival instinct. But these three had learned a different way. They stood together, and standing together made them something greater than three individuals. The adult charged. Ash met it head-on, absorbing the initial impact with surprising resilience. While the adult focused on Ash, Ember and Cinder attacked from the sides. Their fire breath wasn't as powerful as the adult's, but coordinated blasts from three different angles created confusion. The adult turned to snap at Ember. Ash struck from behind. When it redirected to Cinder, all three juveniles fell back in coordinated retreat, maintaining their formation. David watched in amazement. They were fighting like a military unit, covering each other's movements and creating openings through teamwork. The adult was stronger and more experienced, but it had always fought alone. It didn't know how to handle this coordinated resistance. The battle lasted 20 minutes. The adult landed several powerful blows, and all three juveniles took damage. But they never broke formation. Every time one was driven back, the other two created enough pressure to allow recovery. Finally, the adult dragon seemed to reassess. It was winning individual exchanges, but taking steady damage from multiple angles. The juveniles weren't retreating or showing submission. They were defending their territory with unified determination. The adult roared one final challenge, then lifted into the air. It circled once as if memorizing this strange sight, then flew westward back toward the ridge. The three siblings watched until the adult disappeared from view. Then simultaneously they collapsed. All three were exhausted, bleeding from various wounds, but alive. David ran down into the valley, his medical kit bouncing against his hip. This was reckless, approaching three wounded predators, but he couldn't just watch from a distance. To his surprise, none of them reacted defensively when he approached. Ash lifted its head slightly, recognizing him, then lowered it again. The large dragon was too tired to care about pride. David treated their wounds as best he could, applying antiseptic foam to the worst cuts and checking for serious damage. Nothing appeared life-threatening. They were tough creatures built for this environment. As he worked, David realized what he was witnessing. These three dragons had bonded in a way that transcended their original competitive instincts. They weren't just cooperating anymore. They were protecting each other. They'd become what David had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. They'd become family. That evening, the three dragons rested together in the center of the valley. Not in separate territories, not maintaining careful distances, but actually together. Cinder was pressed against Ash's side. Ember had one wing draped over Cinder. They formed a unified mass of scales and warmth, healing together. David sat on his rock and typed up his report. The title practically wrote itself: Induced Social Bonding in Dravidian Flame Worms Through Cooperative Learning Protocols. But that scientific language didn't capture what he was really seeing. Three orphans who'd been fighting for survival had learned something more valuable than hunting or territory. They'd learned that they were stronger together. That brotherhood, even among creatures who'd never known the concept, could be taught. And a human had been the teacher. The colony council meeting room was packed. David stood at the front, his presentation displayed on the large screen behind him. Video footage showed the three dragons working together in ways that no one had thought possible. Hunting cooperatively, defending their territory as a unit, resting together like a family. Governor Harris sat in the center seat, her expression unreadable. Around her, the various department heads watched with a mixture of fascination and concern. The mining director looked particularly nervous. He'd been pushing for expansion into the Eastern Territories, land that now belonged to three very capable predators. The question before us, Harris began, is whether Dr. Reed's project represents a viable long-term solution or merely a temporary curiosity. These creatures are still dangerous. They're growing larger every week. What happens when they reach full adult size? David had prepared for this. They're dangerous the same way any intelligent being is dangerous. Humans can be dangerous too. We build weapons, we wage wars, but we're also capable of cooperation, diplomacy, and coexistence. These dragons have demonstrated those same capabilities. They're not human, the security chief interjected. They're predators with animal instincts. So are we, David replied calmly. Humans evolved as hunters. We have aggressive instincts, territorial behaviors, competitive drives. What separates us isn't the absence of those instincts. It's our ability to choose cooperation over competition when it serves everyone better. He advanced to the next slide, showing the mechanism he'd built. This is what I've been teaching them. Not obedience, not submission, but the fundamental principle that working together creates better outcomes than fighting alone. It's the same principle that allowed humanity to build settlements, then cities, then interstellar colonies. The mining director leaned forward. That's a nice philosophy, but what about practical concerns? We need access to the eastern deposits. Those thermal vents contain rare minerals essential for our reactor systems. Then we negotiate, David said. The dragons use those vents for warmth and hunting. But they don't need exclusive access. If we establish clear boundaries and schedules, both species can benefit from the same resources. Negotiate? The director's voice dripped with skepticism. They're animals. You can't negotiate with animals, David pulled up new footage. This showed him standing with the 3 dragons while a mining crew worked a thermal vent about 100 meters away. The dragons watched but didn't interfere. Occasionally one would vocalize, a low rumble that sounded almost conversational. David would respond with hand gestures, maintaining that strange communication they'd developed. Intelligence isn't binary, David explained. These dragons understand territory, resource sharing, and mutual benefit. They don't need to speak our language to comprehend those concepts. I've established a system of signals and boundaries. They respect it because they've learned that respecting it means everyone gets what they need. Patricia Wong spoke up from the back row. I was skeptical at first. I thought David was crazy for even trying. But I've seen the results. Last week, one of our excavation bots malfunctioned in the valley. It could have damaged the thermal ecosystem. The middle dragon, Ember, actually helped retrieve it. The dragon carefully moved the bot to the valley edge where we could recover it safely. It recognized our equipment and returned it. David added, that's not just trained behavior. That's understanding cause and effect, recognizing that we value our technology and choosing to help rather than ignore or destroy. The room fell silent as people absorbed this information. Finally, Harris spoke. What you're proposing would set a precedent. If we formally recognize these dragons as, what, intelligent neighbors rather than wildlife, that changes everything about how we approach colonization. Yes, David agreed, it does, and maybe that's not a bad thing. Other colonies would think we're insane. Other colonies don't have what we have, a chance to prove that humanity's greatest strength isn't domination. It's adaptation, connection, the ability to build bridges with beings completely unlike ourselves. Harris considered this for a long moment. The Xenobiological Institute sent a response to your reports. They want to send a research team. They're calling this the most significant discovery in interspecies behavioral science in the last 50 years. David felt a weight lift from his chest. Recognition from the Institute meant funding, protection, and legitimacy for his work. But, Harris continued, that attention also brings responsibility. If this fails, if one of those dragons injures or kills a colonist, it won't just impact Dravis 7. It'll affect human expansion policies across multiple systems. I understand the stakes. Do you? Because from where I sit, you've formed an emotional attachment to these creatures. That can cloud judgment. David didn't deny it. You're right. I care about them. But that attachment doesn't make my observations less valid. It makes them more important. We can't coexist with other intelligent species if we can't see them as individuals worthy of respect, rather than just resources to manage or threats to eliminate. The vote came down to a narrow margin, 5 in favor, 4 opposed. David's project would continue with official colony support. The eastern expansion would proceed, but with new protocols, designated safe zones for both species, shared resource schedules, and most importantly, recognition that the 3 dragons were permanent residents of this world, not obstacles to be removed. That evening, David walked down to the valley one last time as the sole researcher. Tomorrow the Institute team would arrive and everything would change. More observers, more equipment, more structure. It was necessary for protecting the dragons long term, but part of him mourned the simplicity of these past weeks. The three siblings were waiting for him at their usual meeting spot. They'd learned his schedule and would come when they knew he'd arrive. Ash lowered its massive head, allowing David to touch the warm scales. Ember watched with those calculating golden eyes that missed nothing. Cinder chirped softly, a sound the small dragon only made around David. "You three are famous now," David told them, knowing they didn't understand his words, but hoping his tone conveyed something. "People are going to come study you, try to understand what makes you special." Ash rumbled, a sound that vibrated through David's chest. "The thing is, you're not that special. You're just three kids who needed someone to show them a better way. You could have kept fighting forever. Stayed alone, stayed afraid, stayed angry. But you chose differently when given the option." He sat down on the ground between them, something he'd never dared to do in those first terrifying days. The three dragons settled around him, their bulk creating a protective circle. "That's the real lesson here," David continued, more to himself than to them. "It's not that I taught you something unique to dragons or unique to Dravis 7. I taught you something universal. That family isn't about blood or species or instinct. It's about choosing to stand together when everything in your nature says to stand alone." Cinder moved closer, resting its head on David's leg. The weight was considerable, but David didn't move. This moment felt important, historic even. Humans figured that out thousands of years ago. We went from tribal warfare to global cooperation because we learned that sharing resources and protecting each other made us stronger than competing for everything. You three learned it in less than a month. Ember exhaled slowly, smoke curling peacefully from its nostrils into the cooling evening air. "Maybe that's humanity's real contribution to the galaxy. Not our technology or our weapons or our ships. Maybe it's this: the ability to teach cooperation. To look at beings completely different from ourselves and say, we can be family if we choose to be." The twin suns set behind the western ridge, painting the volcanic plains in shades of amber and purple. Three dragons who'd been trying to kill each other were now sleeping in a peaceful pile, with a human sitting in the middle of them, safe and protected. David pulled out his personal recorder and made one final log entry. Project conclusion, day 42. The hypothesis has been proven beyond doubt. Dravidian flameworms are capable of learned cooperative behavior, but more than that, they're capable of forming genuine social bonds when given proper guidance and positive reinforcement. They weren't monsters. They were never monsters. They were just orphans who needed someone to show them that there was another way to survive, a better way. He paused, then added quietly, "Recommend this approach be attempted with other so-called dangerous species across human-settled worlds. We've spent too long seeing alien life as things to control or avoid. Maybe it's time we started seeing them as neighbors, as students, as friends." Above them, the stars began to emerge in Dravis 7's darkening sky. Each one represented possibilities. Worlds where humans might land and find creatures that seemed terrifying at first glance. But David had learned something precious here in this valley. Terror was often just misunderstanding, and understanding could be taught one patient lesson at a time, by anyone willing to reach across the gap between species and say, "Let me show you a better way."